Welcome to the lecture on the Great War. That was not so great. In fact, it was terrible. They called it the Great War because it was big. It was the biggest war that had ever happened on the face of the earth until the next World War happened 20 years later. 2 million Russians, 2 million Germans, about a million British, about a million and a quarter French troops were killed in this war, and countless others from other countries, Canada, India, all of the colonial holdings of these groups had troops involved too, and many were killed. The United States lost about 116,000 men to this war. And right on the tail end of this war, the 1918 flu epidemic happened, which killed many, many more across the world. This was a terrible war. People thought it would never happen again. They were wrong. So we call it the Great War, World War I. And you can see 1914 to 1919. And you can see a picture of American troops here wearing their gas masks and all of that good stuff. We'll talk about why that was in a little bit. But this was a terrible war. And this was a war that no one was really expecting. It just sort of happened. Although, looking back on it, it should have been pretty obvious that it was going to happen. Questions always asked, how did this war start? And it's a difficult question to answer exactly. World War II, we can kind of pinpoint, certainly with our part of it, Pearl Harbor, something like that. A lot of times that happens. But the easy answer here is that Ferdinand, who was the son of the emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, so he's the Archduke Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo in June of 1914. The Austro-Hungarian Empire doesn't exist anymore as a result of this war. It encompassed, as we'll see on a map later, what is Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and parts of the Balkans. And some of that was Serbia, Croatia, and all these places. Some of you may have had the pleasure of going to Kosovo or Bosnia or some such place in the army. And if you have, those places are very hostile toward each other. And Ferdinand is from Austria. The leadership of this empire is in Austria, and everyone hates them, right? And he actually survived a couple of other assassination attacks, and this kid shot them as they were driving by, as they were getting ready to leave. Well, the easy answer, again, is how this war started, is that Ferdinand was killed, and then that sort of set things in motion, and a few days later, Germany declares war on Russia. Germany then invades France through Belgium, and away we go. That's the easy answer. A better answer is Ferdinand's assassination is the match that lit the bonfire of this war. So you see a map here that has the Triple Entente in the orange and the Triple Alliance in the blue. We'll talk about them in a second. You see the Austro-Hungarian Empire right there in the middle of that. So there's a couple of things here that are leading toward this war, and these are actually fairly common things that lead to war. And the first is limited industrial resources are fueling expansion. So everyone's looking for more resources because, this new industrial world that has developed in the late part of the 1800s and, of course, the beginning of the 1900s, resources are hugely important. So metals and coal and all those sorts of things. And everyone's trying to get their hands on it, both in Europe and abroad. So colonization hasn't stopped. This is part of why we had the Spanish-American War, part of why we have the Roosevelt Corollary. And we just didn't want Europe doing that in our half of the world. Well, they're doing it in the rest of the world for sure. Militarism also sparks an arms race. That's just fancy talk for every country is building bigger militaries. They're building bigger ships, bigger guns, bigger everything. And eventually what happens is you rub someone the wrong way and people start shooting. And so that provides some of the answer to why this blew up in their face in 1914. And through the many, many decades leading up to this war, alliances are being made that create these two large competing groups. So you can see the orange and the blue. And you have Germany and Austria-Hungary allying in the later 1800s, and then Italy joining that pact. And those are going to be called the Triple Alliance on this map. but the Central Powers also. And of course, they'll add other groups like Turkey and so on once the war begins. And then, as a response to that, the first thing that's going to happen is France and Russia are going to ally themselves together. And that's kind of a crazy thought because those two countries couldn't be more different in terms of how they're run. Russia's a dictatorship. They have a czar, a king, and it's pretty horrible. And France is this new democratic republic that's now present, and they just don't see eye to eye on anything, except they're all afraid of the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians, and then later the Italians, that triple alliance. Someone described it one time to me as it's a fortress. You can see the blues like a fortress in the middle of Europe, and everyone outside of that fortress is afraid that those people are going to come out and attack them. And so France and Russia join forces, and eventually Britain joins forces too. Now, if you were with me in 1301, or when you studied 1301, American history 1301, that France and England are enemies. They've been enemies almost forever. Well, now they're not. Now they're allies. And in modern history, they've been allies, and that's because they're Western democratic nations who have many things in common. And so that then creates the Allied powers, or the Triple Entente, as it's called on this map. So you're going to have these two groups, and eventually they're going to do something, and that something is Archduke Ferdinand getting killed in Serbia. And that just basically blows this whole thing out of the water. So once I think Hungary declares, or Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, that starts activating all these other treaties, and then boom, Germany decides to also invade France. They also invade Russia. It's a huge war. This is a true world war. We're focused on the European part of it, but it happens in Africa, and it happens in Asia. It won't really happen much in the Western Hemisphere because we're going to prevent that. But, of course, we'll get involved too. Canada gets involved as an ally to Britain, and so on. So it is a true, large, humongous world war. I always like to ask the class this question when we're together, and I know you can't answer me right now, but I would be willing to guess that the answer to this question is very small, like less than 6. And how many World War I movies you can name? People can name all kinds of World War II movies, and maybe Vietnam movies, and probably Civil War movies. You might be able to come up with a handful of World War I movies. This image here is from a 2001 film called The Lost Battalion. It's pretty good. It's about Major Whittlesey. That's the guy kind of in the middle there. And his battalion that gets cut off and lost. And just this past year, a movie called 1917 came out, which was great. Highly recommended if you haven't seen it yet. Super intense movie. There aren't that many. And part of the reason, I believe, is because this war is not really that interesting from a war standpoint. Now, my degree is actually in military history. And so, I've put a little time into this stuff. And World War I just isn't that great to think about. It isn't that great to talk about. There's heroes and there's great stuff happening. But when you compare it to pretty much any other war, it just doesn't stand up. It was long, it was nasty, but not a lot of movement happened. A whole bunch of people get killed, and it really feels like for no reason. And we'll kind of talk about why that happened in a bit. And so, not a lot of movies. You might say, well, Wonder Woman, of course, took place during World War I. Yeah, I guess that counts. So, the war kicks off in 1914. Again, Ferdinand gets killed in June. I think Germany actually begins invading France through Belgium in August. And sometimes you might hear the phrase, the guns of August. And it happened. And of course, Woodrow Wilson is now in his second year as president of the United States. And he's a progressive. And the war started. Americans kind of went, well, we don't want to get involved. Let's stay out of it. And so we are declared neutral. Wilson declares the United States to be neutral. And that means a lot of things. That means we can still trade with Germany and Italy and France and England and whoever we want, and everyone's supposed to leave us alone. Now, that's not going to happen, but that's what's supposed to happen. And so we declared ourselves neutral. We sold stuff to everybody, whoever wanted it, for at least the beginning of the war. as the war goes, we'll start leaning towards selling more and more to the Allies, our friends, Britain, France, than we will to the Germans. And there's a number of reasons for that. Another reason why neutrality happens, one, of course, Woodrow Wilson's a progressive, and progressives don't really like war. You might be saying, well, what about Roosevelt? Roosevelt liked war. He thought war was necessary sometimes, but note, he only engaged in these little tiny wars. There was no really invading countries and taking over stuff. That had already happened in a couple of cases. But this war that we're talking about here is a whole different situation. And so remember, progressives want to fix things, right? They want to enact laws and enact programs that fix social problems or corruption problems or business problems, and war doesn't do that. War destroys not just people, but land and resources, and so it's the very opposite of the things that he would want. Now, of course, we're going to get into the war, so he's going to have to change how he thinks a little bit about it, but he will. But this is not something that anyone really wants to get into. Most Americans, though, philosophically support the British and the French, right? They don't support the Germans. Now, it's interesting that at this point in time, right, early 1900s America, this is 1914, there are huge numbers of immigrants coming to this country, most of them coming from Europe. Some of them are German, and some of those Germans really kind of side with Germany. Some of them are Italian, some of them are Austrian or Czech or Hungarian, and they might side with those groups. Most Americans, though, are going to side with their, again, philosophical friends, the British and the French. There will be, during this war, an anti-German sentiment. We kind of mentioned that in a previous lecture. Why did we have the prohibition happen in 1918? Part of that's the anti-German sentiment, which kind of carries an anti-alcohol sentiment. And I know that's hard for some of you to believe, but believe me, that's what happened. So Germans were changing their names because people were persecuting them and things like that. So Johann Schmidt became John Smith or something like that to try to hide some of that connection. People didn't eat sauerkraut. I mean, I don't know why anybody would eat sauerkraut anyway, but people would stop eating sauerkraut and drinking beer because all those things were associated with Germany. But again, most Americans just sort of on their own philosophically supported the Allies, though they wanted to remain out of the war. The challenge we face is our economic interests are aligned with the Allies far more than they are with the Germans or the other Central Powers. Britain and France are big trade partners with us. And so this war is going to impact that tremendously. Also, it comes down to, I don't have it on the list here, but it comes down to national security. The British are important to American security. They're sort of the outer ring, if you will, of our security. You got to go through the British before you can get to us. And that's all being threatened. So we're going to stay neutral, but of course, obviously, we will get to the war anyway. So this war is all about trench warfare, and I think this is part of why you're not going to see a ton of movies about this, because, man, it's just horrible to watch. It's horrible to even contemplate what was going on in this war. And if you have seen 1917, you'll probably note that almost none of that took place in the trenches. That was not the focus of that particular film. Nor was it the focus of the Lost Battalion either. And I think that the reason why is no one wants to watch this. So I just got a bunch of pictures on this slide, and you can see these in the top right. These are probably British soldiers kind of sitting in this trench, and you can't really see it, but there's water in the bottom. And so these guys are in the trenches, and they're manning the trenches 12 months a year for 5 years, right? So rain or shine, snow, whatever, they're in the trenches, and they get sick. And of course they're fighting, and there's all sorts of horrible things going on, and yet you're stuck living in these trenches, and that's where they lived. Bombs going off, shooting, and all that stuff. You kept your head down, and you dealt with everything that was going on. This picture up on the top left is an aerial photo of one of many trench systems. So these things could go for miles. Just miles and miles of trenches kind of facing each other, and you can kind of see the big dark spot in the center. That's no man's land. So there's a big trench on one side and a series that are connected to it. Then there's a big trench on the other side, kind of up in the corner. and then a bunch of trenches connected to that. So each side occupies one of those trenches. And the only way to get to the other side is to get up out of your trench and run as fast as you can across no man's land, which was covered with barbed wire and mines and, of course, holes, from explosions and things like that. And then the guys on the other side are shooting at you. And we'll talk about some of the technology here. So typically what would happen is the orders would come down, and we're going to attack the German lines at first light tomorrow morning. And so you'd get freshly loaded out. You'd get a hot meal if you could, and then you get your orders, where you're supposed to go, what you're supposed to do. And then your artillery would bombard their side to try to keep their heads down. And then at the appointed time, your platoon leaders and your officers are blowing whistles and making everybody go up and over. They're going up and over too. And you've got a rifle with a bolt action rifle with the bayonet on it. And you're running as fast as you can and hoping to get to the other side before they start shooting you. And then once you get there, you go hand-to-hand combat, and you hope you get reinforced before they do. It's a terrible, terrible situation. But like all wars, we're fighting these wars at the limits of the technology. So, again, in the French Indian War, the American Revolution, they kind of stood in lines and they shot at each other because that's what the weaponry allowed. In the Civil War, it was similar, but the weapons were much better. And so World War I, we're still kind of stuck on old school tactics, but the weapons are much, much more deadly. And then you see on this map, the sort of dark spaces are where the battlefields are. This is the Western Front, which is pretty much mostly in France. There's also an Eastern Front in Russia, which looks a lot like this. And of course, their colonial powers are fighting in other places too, but this is where the bulk of the fighting takes place. And so those trench systems are located all along here. And again, some of them are miles and miles long. And these guys are just in there living there and defending it. And you can see not a lot of movement happened. The Germans invaded pretty early, and then they just got stuck in these lines. The British and the French kind of filled in. The Americans showed up toward the end. And the whole thing just kind of bogged down, and all this fighting takes place in basically the same area for the duration of the war. It's a terrible, terrible way to go. Whereas if you watch anything about World War II, rarely do they stay in the same place for very long. It's a war of movement and change, where this war is just stagnant. And people are dying from disease because they're stuck living in these trenches for so long. And they get trench foot and trench rot and all these different crazy diseases that happen to them, not to mention all the usual ones. And remember, we had a massive flu epidemic that swept through all of the world right as this war was coming to an end. So this is a horrible way to fight. World War II is going to be much deadlier, but it's fought very, very differently. And I said there's some new technology involved here. New technology always means bigger war, it seems like. So you've got, of course, the infantryman typically carries a bolt-action rifle with a bayonet, a shovel. He'll have to have a gas mask because gas is going to be used. You can see on one of these pictures some machine gun operators wearing their gas mask. But a lot of new things kind of come about in this war. Tanks, you can see on the bottom there. Tanks in World War I are not like tanks in World War II. They're slow. They're more like mobile guns. They're built to kind of try to bust through some of these lines, where they have all these trenches and whatever. So they're more like armored transport than they are cavalry units like they're used in World War II. Of course, you have machine guns. Now we had machine guns in the Spanish-American War, but everybody's got tons of them in this war. And just imagine running at the enemy while they're shooting back with machine guns. It's just awful. Now, I said they'll use gas, chlorine gas, mustard gas. The problem with using gas, of course, is once you release it, you lose control of it, and it could hurt you as much as it does the enemy, and it often does. It's been outlawed, of course, not long after this war ended because it's so dangerous and deadly to everybody. But it created a lot of injuries. In fact, Hitler, who was a decorated veteran of World War I for Germany, was injured in a gas attack and went to hospital. And obviously survived and became the leader of Germany later. U-boats are submarines. That's the German, sort of Americanized German name for a submarine. And you can see one at the top there. So the Germans kind of figured out how to make submarines work and effective. And we had submarines in the Civil War, but they're kind of a joke. And so they are going to use submarines to attack British and American shipping and French shipping, and they're going to be very, very successful. And of course, we have airplanes in this war. Most people are aware of the old biplanes, and there's sort of a romantic feel to that, right? The biplanes, these sort of knights of the air, the Red Baron you might have heard of, this great German ace. I was reading something that said the average lifespan of a British airplane pilot was 93 flying hours in this war. That's not a terribly high number of missions. Keep in mind, these planes are made of paper and wood, and they're trying to shoot at each other, and they're trying to avoid being shot. A lot of times they would just snap in half, that kind of thing. And what those guys were doing was primarily trying to defend their recon planes. It was very important that you could take pictures of what was happening behind the German lines, right? You saw those big complexes of trenches. We wanted to know what they were doing. If they were massing somewhere, we would want to know. So we would send planes to take pictures. They would send planes to shoot those planes down. So we would send planes to shoot their planes down. And so you get these dogfights. Didn't really use a lot of bombing or anything like that. That kind of technology isn't really available until World War II, which of course it's going to be massive scale bombing. So very, very different situation. Lots of other weapons. If you get a chance, just Google medieval World War I weapons. They are very medieval. There's clubs, spiked clubs and bats, daggers, axes, and then of course shotguns. And the Americans brought over a kind of repurposed Browning shotgun that every American had a bird gun, and so they just converted it to war, put a bayonet on it, shortened the barrel, call it a hall sweeper today. Browning also came up with a light machine gun called the BAR, Browning Automatic Rifle, which was in use for decades after this. At least through Vietnam and probably way later. And of course the Germans, the French, the British were all coming up with their versions of these things too. It's kind of funny, the Germans complained about the shotguns that Americans had and said they were inhumane, while, of course, everyone's using gas and all these other things. So a lot of technology, big guns, that's why lots of people are getting killed, and not a lot anyone could do about it. The war just had to play out, and both sides had to wear down. So obviously America is going to go to war, and so a little bit here about our road to war. So we declared neutrality when the war started, but about 3 years later, we're going to declare war. And there's a lot of things going on. We can't talk about all of them right here, but just a few of them on the screen. So the Germans sunk a ship called the Lusitania in May of 1915, and about 128 Americans were killed. And this kind of thing's going to happen periodically throughout the war. They're going to sink, that was a passenger liner, which shouldn't have happened. They're going to sink merchant ships, and so people are going to get killed. Americans are going to get killed. And remember, Woodrow Wilson's the idealist, right? So he would go, and at the beginning of the war, he tried to play peacemaker for all the countries, but that's not going to happen. And then he's telling the Germans, well, you guys need to stop doing this. This is wrong. You're violating our neutrality, which was true. The Germans kind of went, okay, sorry, we're not going to do that for a while. Meanwhile, as the war goes on, right, the Allies, the British and the French in particular, are running out of food, and they're running out of supplies, and they're running out of men, and this is becoming a critical issue. And so the United States is going to join this war one way or the other sometime in 1917, because we have to. Because if Britain goes down, we're in trouble. We're in real trouble. And so as time passes, Americans are more and more and more inclined to get into this war. Woodrow Wilson won re-election, of course, in 1916, and the slogan was, he kept us out of the war. But I think even then he knew we were going to go to war, and he's already trying to figure out how to explain that to the country. And he, of course, is sworn in March of 1917. And you can see we're going to declare war in April. And I don't think Wilson was lying or hiding anything, but the fact is a lot of things have changed. And so he kind of has to change his outlook on war. We'll talk about that in a bit. You can see this thing in January called the Zimmermann Telegram, which is basically an attempt by the Germans to enlist Mexico to fight against the United States if we were to enter the war. Mexico, fortunately for themselves and for us, says no thanks. But Germany has been meddling with other countries too. And in fact, they're one of the financiers of the Russian Communist Revolution that happens just a few months later. In February, Germany then starts attacking everything again. That's called unrestricted submarine warfare. See, they're only supposed to attack people who are actually fighting them, so the British and the French and the Russians. They aren't supposed to attack any ship flying an American flag, for example, because we're neutral. Well, they violated that over and over and over. Many people are killed, many ships are sunk by German U-boats. So not long after that, we sever diplomatic ties with Germany. And then a couple months later, we're going to declare war on Germany. And of course, then everyone declares war on us and so on and so forth. And so we're at it. The problem is we're not totally ready to go to war. It's going to take us months, really a full year to get fully mobilized. We will have troops there as early as June of 1917, but not in large numbers. And so really it's probably spring where we're really fully engaged of the following year. So, we're going to fight technically for about 18 months, but a lot of it happens in that last year. So we declare war on Germany. We're officially in the war. And unfortunately, a few months later, Russia has their, they have a number of revolutions, but here in the end of 1917, it's the Bolshevik Revolution or the Communist Revolution. And they kind of took over things, and the Germans basically financed that. And when that happened, Russia said, all right, we're out of the war, and they're going to sign an armistice with Germany. And that's really bad news because Germany has been fighting this war in France and at the same time, this huge war in Russia. Well, now they don't have to fight in Russia anymore, and they're going to move all those men and guns down to France, which is going to bolster or strengthen their lines in Europe. Meanwhile, the French and the British are losing men faster than they can replace them. And we're having a little bit of a tough time getting our guys over there. I mean, could you imagine this? You enlist for the army and you go through your training, and then they go, well, you're going to get on this ship and you're going to take 2 or 3 weeks to sail to England or to France, and we're going to really try hard not to let a German U-boat sink one of the transport ships. And all you can do is lay in your bunk and try not to throw up the whole time. It's pretty rough. Fortunately, all of our guys made it. The Navy did a great job protecting us. So we get there and we will fight. And we will fight a lot. We're not going to talk about battles and go into all those details of this war. It's just not something we're doing in this class. So it took us a while to ramp up. We fought a lot of battles in that last year and a half of the war. So I mentioned earlier that Wilson had to kind of do a 180 on his thinking. Remember, progressives don't like war because war doesn't fix things. War destroys things. So Wilson and Europe, to try to get America in, kind of has to treat this war. This is a war to save civilization. This is a war to save democracy. This is a war that's going to help people. And they kind of do a 180, like this is a war that's going to fix things. And when the war happens, of course, when we start the war, he does, I think, a smart thing. He finds the general, in this case, General Pershing, and he says, I want you to go over there and I want you to take care of business. And I want you to do what you have to do. And Wilson, of course, is the president of the United States and the commander-in-chief, and he lets his experts do their job. He gives the orders and he controls everything, but he lets the men do their job. And I think that was very wise. And he told Pershing to keep a separate army. The British and the French wanted us to just come and kind of reinforce everything, but we don't trust the British and the French. One, there's a language barrier, especially with the French, right? The French don't speak English. I mean, the British barely speak English, right? And so there'd be a lot of logistical problems there too. We don't trust them. We've seen how they fought this war over the last 3 or 4 years, and we've seen how they've wasted men. They waste men like crazy, and we don't trust their commanders. The British, for example, just kept charging these trenches with horses, with cavalry units. And I don't think it takes much imagination to recognize that cavalry units charging into machine gun fire is a bad idea. And yet they kept doing it. Tradition, that kind of thing. And so what Pershing does is he just keeps his armies separate. He keeps control of the armies. We're gonna move in and take over areas and allow the British and the French to kind of pull their lines together. And that's going to save a lot of American lives. As I said at the beginning, 1 million British soldiers are going to get killed in this war. Just over 100,000 American soldiers are going to get killed. 2 million Germans and 2 million Russians are going to get killed in this war. But again, just over 100,000 Americans. So some of that's because we came late, but some of that's because we fought this war a little bit more carefully than they did for all those years. So again, about 18 months, we're going to do some super heavy fighting. Sometimes as many as 1 million Americans will be involved in some of these huge battles. On November 11th, 1918, a ceasefire agreement is signed. That day comes to be known as Armistice Day until 1954, when we went ahead and renamed it Veterans Day. I think the Europeans call it Remembrance Day. So November 11th is Veterans Day. It's where we remember all of our veterans. And we've had, again, a number of wars, right? At that point, 3 pretty good-sized wars. World War I, World War II, which was followed by Korea. And at that point, we then created Veterans Day. So at the end of World War I, though, what happens is all of this fighting took place in Western and Eastern Europe, and it devastated all of their economies, and it wiped out huge portions of their population. And it's soldiers, right? So it's not just 2 million Russians died or 2 million Germans died. It's 2 million young men died. So that whole generation is thinned out tremendously. And then imagine 20 years later, the same thing's going to happen. So the U.S. comes out of this war as being the most powerful nation in the world. We didn't have any war take place on our territory. We barely lost any men, relatively speaking. We have bigger industry now than we've ever had, and because of the war, we're bigger than all of the other countries in Europe. They're devastated. So we now are the superpower that comes out of all of this conflict. And that will, of course, last for a little while until the Great Depression happens and lays everybody low. We'll get to that lecture soon. Now, as we wrap up this lecture, I want to talk about what I call the world's worst peace treaty, and it is called the Treaty of Versailles because it was pretty much signed or finished up in the Palace of Versailles near Paris. The reality is most of this treaty was worked out by what we call the Big Four, and you can see this picture here, and in order from left to right, that's Britain, that's the Prime Minister of Britain. And then you see Italy. It might sound strange that Italy is on this list because they were part of the Triple Alliance, right? They were part of the Central Powers, the bad guys. Well, they changed sides. And then you see the guy with the big mustache is the guy from France, and the tall guy is Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson actually went to Europe. And that was a big deal because no sitting American president has ever left the country until this point. And he sailed all the way to Europe to try to imprint what he wanted to have happen on this peace process. Unfortunately, Germany and the other losers weren't really able to do any real negotiating. So the Big Four basically made all the decisions, and they didn't necessarily listen to Woodrow Wilson. They already had a number of agendas already in play, and we'll talk about kind of some of the results of that in a minute. So Wilson has this thing he called the 14-point plan for peace. And I'm not, of course, giving you all 14 of them, but these are some of the things Wilson wanted. So remember, I told you in the previous lecture that he is an idealist, right? Wouldn't it be great if we all got along? And that's how some of his ideas come out. When Wilson goes to Europe, everybody cheers. It's a huge deal. Wilson interprets that like, hey, everybody must agree with me. Everybody must do what I want to do, what I want to do. But really, it's just everybody cheering because the American president's here, and that's never happened before. And the war's over. And America really helped us win the war. And so he's super famous and super popular. I would bet that almost nobody actually knows what his 14 points are, right? They just know that he's the president of the United States. Well, here's some examples. He wants freedom of the seas. So remember, that's a particular sticking point for Americans. This war is not the first time that our neutrality has been violated by European countries. All the way back to George Washington's presidency, which began in 1789. Remember, Europe went to war. The French Revolution caused France to go to war with everybody. Eventually, Napoleon comes on the scene. All through that whole period, our neutrality was being violated by both the British and the French and all of their allies. And it happens again during other times as well. And then, so this is nothing new. So in this treaty, he wants to do this whole thing about freedom of the seas and kind of set that in stone. That's not really going to happen. Those other allies don't really care as much about it as we do. He wants to reduce armaments, right? Wouldn't it be great if we all just didn't make so many guns? Well, yeah, probably. But is that really going to happen? Is that reality? I mean, it would be nice. And so this treaty is not going to have much reduction in armaments. In fact, the only countries that are going to reduce armaments are the losers, at least the losers that survive, and not all of them survived this treaty. He wants free trade. He wants to lower barriers to trade, and that's not going to happen. Everybody's charging huge amounts of tariffs, which are taxes on foreign goods, to try to protect their own goods. He says, no, we should just be able to trade with everybody. He wants more autonomy, and that is self-governance by these different groups. And that's going to happen in some cases, but not in others. And I'll show you on a map in a second. And then one of his big ideas is called the League of Nations. And it's kind of a precursor to the United Nations. And the League of Nations actually is going to happen, except the United States is not going to join the League of Nations. So, the League of Nations, again, think about it from Wilson's perspective. Wouldn't it be great if all of the nations of the world could get together and instead of go to war, and again, nobody at this point in time wants to go back to war, right? So instead of go to war, we could hash out all of our differences in a room somewhere and then vote and then come to conclusions. Wouldn't that be great? That's a very American way to do things. We've done it throughout most of our history. But it's not the way the world works. And it would be great, except it doesn't work. And then, in fact, when the treaty comes back to America, the Senate looks at the treaty. And remember, from your government class, if you've taken it. If not, I'm sorry, you have to take it. It's super boring, but you have to take it. But one of the things you'll learn is that the Senate has the authority to ratify treaties. So the State Department or the president can sign a treaty or make a treaty, but the Senate, Congress still has to ratify it. They took one look at the League of Nations and said, no, we can't sign this. And in fact, we never sign the Treaty of Versailles. We're technically going to stay at war for a little while longer, even though no shots are fired. And the reason that they won't sign it is because Congress says our ultimate law is the Constitution, and so we can't put ourselves in a situation where we could get voted out of doing what our Constitution says. So they simply refuse to join. Wilson's furious. He kind of goes on a world, not a world tour, but a U.S. tour to try to drum up support. And unfortunately for him, one, this thing's not going to get signed, and two, he has a stroke or a couple of pretty bad strokes along the way and actually disappears from public life for a while. It's kind of weird. In fact, his wife is the only person and his doctor that talked to him for a number of weeks. And so there's a potential there that Mrs. Wilson was actually making decisions instead of him because he was bedridden. We don't know. So, ladies, we might have had a woman acting president for those few weeks. Hard to say. So the League of Nations never, it happens, but the U.S. never joins. And we'll see in other lectures how ineffective it actually is. It is different than the United Nations. That comes about after World War II, so we'll talk about that at that point. So Wilson's 14-point plan for peace, really, most of it really doesn't happen. And so here you see on this map, and I think your book in this chapter that's dealing with World War I has a really good map that's side by side. I can't remember what page it's on. But if you look at that, you'll see this real comparison between what it looked like and what it was. That's what this is trying to do. You can see, for example, that sort of orangey, that sort of yellowish gold color right in the middle. that was Austro-Hungarian Empire, and it gets completely blown up, right? You see Austria-Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania gets more territory. They make a country called Yugoslavia out of Croatia, Serbia, Montenegro, and a couple others. You can see that the Austro-Hungarian Empire doesn't exist anymore. You can see Poland is created out of Russia, Germany, and part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. You can see a couple of countries are carved out of Russia up there. You can see France gets a little extra territory. Italy gets a little extra territory, and so on. So a lot of changes happen. Europe looks very different, all right? Germany gets smaller. The losers, note, got smaller or completely destroyed, and the winners got bigger. Imagine that. Again, the big four kind of made all the decisions. I forgot to talk about Japan. If you go back to the previous slide for a minute, I forgot to mention how Japan was treated in this process. Japan was there. Japan was an ally to the French, the British, and the Americans, and the Russians. Japan did their part, but they were largely ignored during the peace treaty process, and they became very angry and ultimately left. And, one wonders, many historians have wondered that if the Japanese had been treated better here, that 20 years later they don't start their own invasions of Asia. Basically, Japan was so angry at how they were treated that they went home and said, fine, we don't care what Europe does or America. We're going to do what we want, and we're going to challenge them. And so ultimately that's what happens. But if we had treated Japan well, Japan would have been an ally instead of an enemy in the next war. I don't know. Something to think about. The same could be said for Vietnam and Korea, and a lot of the people that were involved in those places, they had ties to Japan and ties to France, in Vietnam's case in particular, and a number of people kind of soured on the whole big nation diplomacy thing, and some of those nations, again, will turn to communism. So, again, Europe completely changes. So Woodrow Wilson wanted more autonomy. Some people got more autonomy. He wanted to recreate Poland. That happened. The Czechs, the Hungarians, the Austrians, that was all separated, and they got more control over their own area. But Yugoslavia was a country created out of about 5 or 6 other countries, and those people all hate each other. All right. And the fact is that there are Germans in Austria and Germans in Czechoslovakia, and there are Poles in Czechoslovakia, and there are Hungarians in Austria. And so, of course, there's Germans in France and French people in Germany. And the idea that everyone can govern themselves nationally, one, is a pipe dream. You'll never be able to sort that out. And two, that actually just creates more opportunities for war. That's called nationalism. Everyone's bound by their ethnic origins, and so they tend to fight with one another because of that. And that, you could probably say, that's probably another reason why World War I happened too, and it's definitely part of why World War II happened. We'll get into that later. So Europe is completely changed. The other big thing that happens is Germany basically is blamed for the whole war, and they have to pay what are called reparations. You know how if you get into a car accident and it's your fault, you have to pay to fix their car and all that stuff, and if they get hurt, you have to pay for that? That's reparations. So you have an insurance company that does that. Well, Germany is blamed for the war. They're going to be charged billions of dollars for everything they destroyed and all this. The problem is Germany's in no shape to repay it. They had a revolution right at the end of the war. The new government didn't like how things were going. They were losing. The whole economy collapsed, and they finally got rid of the king. And then this new government finally surrenders because their economy completely died during this war. We didn't really invade Germany. They just stopped fighting because they couldn't anymore, and their economy collapsed. And now they owe billions of dollars to the Allies. Of course, the Allies owe billions of dollars to the United States, so maybe that's part of why they put these reparations on Germany. And we're going to see in another lecture that this crushing of Germany is what, in part, brings about the Great Depression, and also, in part, what brings about World War II, which is really just an extension of this war. But that's something for another time. So As we wrap this up, the next lecture is going to talk about the United States in the post World War I era, basically the 1920s, the Roaring Twenties. The business of the United States is business, is what I'm calling this lecture, because we're kind of gonna go old school. We're gonna go throwback. We're gonna go back to those presidents that do things the old way. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's not my job to steer the ship, but to make sure it doesn't hit the rocks. And we're going to let businesses grow, and we're going to develop all this stuff, and we're going to get wealthy. It's going to be great. And then it's all going to collapse. So those are the topics for the next couple of lectures. But the next one is the business of the United States is business.